I think there was a lot of gaming of the whole thing. I mean, I was slightly worried because, while there is the huge spectacle of all these people arriving, that we heard people in the White House were apparently starstruck, which doesn't happen very often. You haven't seen so many people turning up with 24 hours notice at the drop of a hat for a meeting in the White House before. This is pretty extraordinary stuff.
Now let's start with events in Washington. Has Donald Trump's unique way of doing business brought us closer to Ukrainians being free from Russian missile and drone attacks? That's the question. Manveen, the test for us is without Donald Trump, the war could have been carrying on with no hope of any form of solution. This is the best case argument for Donald Trump, I think. Do we feel we're close to some form of resolution after yesterday than we were before that, do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, there was, this was a remarkable moment. It did feel like it was like some sort of Marvel movie with all these sort of European leaders all descending at once onto Washington. A huge spectacle, as was Alaska, a huge spectacle. But whether anything comes of it at the end of all of that is still very much up in the air, because all of this comes down to whether Ukrainians will be willing to cede territory, which the only way you can imagine that happening is if they have a watertight security guarantee. Over the weekend, you had Donald Trump already, putting out on Truth Social in capital letters, there will never be any NATO membership for them. People are talking about Article 5, but without NATO. What does that mean? I mean, if I was sitting in Kyiv right now, I would have a very good memory of that moment at the end of the Cold War when the Ukrainians were told to get rid of their nuclear weapons, sign the Budapest Memorandum, which meant that there was supposed to be a security guarantee already in place. That without NATO membership, they were supposed to have Russia, America, people guaranteeing their security if anybody ever invaded. 2014 happened, nobody turned up. This war has happened, we've provided weapons, but nobody else has been on the ground fighting with them. What sort of a security guarantee would actually give them any confidence in the future now if it's not full NATO membership?
And that implies actually that Donald Trump is even such a details person that a security guarantee beyond his own woolly words would be forthcoming. And they may never be forthcoming. It may just be a don't worry, we'll be there for you.
It's down to the administration apparently to come up with one. And that means, sort of Marco Rubio, we're told, is sort of coming up with the words. Steve Witkoff, who it's already been quite clear in all of these negotiations, is not a details man. There was a very awkward moment last week where he had to have a succession of three separate calls with European governments because he kept briefing them the wrong things about what the Russians had agreed. At first he was like, they're willing to give up all other claims as long as you give them Donetsk. And they were like, well, have they actually said that? Not exactly. And then eventually it sort of unravels into, they're not details men. These are real estate men who it's all about sort of the big feeling, the big sort of pitch effectively. On the podcast today, we had Mark Galeotti who said this whole meeting is basically playing the real estate game. You've got to go, as you do in real estate, you've got to sell Trump a dream, something he feels he can buy into, and he'll talk it big, he'll talk it up. But whether that actually comes down to anything solid that the people of Ukraine can think it's worth giving up, Donetsk is a hugely, sort of industrialized area. It sort of had huge mining assets, mineral assets. It's actually a huge untapped reserve of gas underneath there too, which would completely change Ukraine's economy the moment they were sort of using it. It would also be a huge competitor to Russia's gas dominance in Europe. There are many reasons why this is a really strategic asset, and you'd be asking the Ukrainians to give up land which they still hold, that they've lost a lot of lives fighting for, in order to be backed by a woolly security guarantee. And despite the spectacle, I don't think that amounts to much.
No, and we had a Ukrainian MP on this morning who basically said they're willing to freeze the current front line, but they're not willing to go beyond that. And I wonder whether that's...
cede sovereignty, even if you've frozen that front line.
That's exactly right. Alex, you're in a conversation with a bunch of cynical journalists. You're a cynical ex-politician. Are we right to be sceptical or cynical here? Or do you think maybe we should give Trump credit for at least moving things forward?
Listen, I can out-cynic all of you. No, look, I think that you're broadly right. I would just say this, though. The most powerful force in politics, on one view, is momentum, the big mo, as it's sometimes referred to in the United States. There is momentum here. And I think it's possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. In other words, cynicism, but also a measure of optimism. What I mean by that is, yes, everything that's been said about the willingness of the security guarantees is correct. However, there is now this kind of remorseless drumbeat towards some sort of progress, even though the kind of big picture guys are, as it were, they are being replaced by the the officials, the military experts who are flying over from the UK to speak to their counterparts in the United States as well. And they will be wanting to hammer out something that is far more specific. Without security guarantees, and let's just be clear what we mean, unless the Americans are prepared to provide the intelligence, some of that targeting information, which we don't have, and the air defenses, then this will go nowhere. And the question now will be, once the leaders have left the table, so to speak, physically and metaphorically, and the experts are in there, whether that can be hammered out. Because if it can, I do think that there is the potential for some sort of arrangement, which is a bit like the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territories, in other words, where Ukraine says, we still own legally Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and of course, Crimea, but we accept that it is frozen for all practical purposes. Yeah. That's where I think there is a possible landing zone, and I think there is some momentum towards that.
Just on that point, though, the security point, does it not need to go be further than that? Because the idea of NATO membership without NATO is effectively, if you take another scrap of land, Russia, the entirety of the world is coming at you militarily. That's the Article 5 argument. That's what's been so successful for decades. That's why there's not been a hot war during the Cold War. NATO existed, and therefore it was very clear what the security guarantee is. You come after one of us, there's a chance you come after all of us. But that's specifically not being offered. And I wonder whether that means there is no security guarantee.
That's a great point. Look, ultimately, he has to feel, Putin has to fear that the gates of hell would open if he set one foot across whatever this line of control is. And that ultimately is the question mark. Now, the gates of hell could take a number of forms. It could be whether it's not just Patriot missiles, but offensive US missiles in country. It could be troops. We'll have to see. But there's got to be an effective deterrent. Because the point that was made really powerfully just now, I think is the right one, is that it seems clear to me, and I think most people, that if Ukraine had not unilaterally given up its nuclear deterrent following the fall of the Soviet Empire, I suspect this war would never have happened.
We'd be in a very different place.
So again, the world would be a different place. The world would be a different place. And so it comes down to the credibility of that deterrent. I would hope and expect the Europeans will be saying, look, US boots on the ground, but if that is not going to happen, it's going to have to be something sort of similarly deterring and terrifying.
What did you think of Starmer and the Europeans? To us, it looked like Manveen was playing the firmer role. Could that have been cooked up in advance? So
I think there was a lot of gaming of the whole thing. I mean, I was slightly worried because, while there is the huge spectacle of all these people arriving, that we heard people in the White House were apparently starstruck, which doesn't happen very often. You haven't seen so many people turning up with 24 hours notice at the drop of a hat for a meeting in the White House before. This is pretty extraordinary stuff. There was a danger that you'd have too many cooks, people talking over each other. You've got a lot of big egos there too. Macron, Merz, everybody wanting to take the firmer hand. Starmer's kind of in there. I thought the man behind him actually is probably the more powerful. Jonathan Powell, you could see all the way through, who I think has a much more influence in actually shaping what's going to come out of all of this. But I actually thought they'd clearly gamed it beforehand. They'd worked out who would speak and when. And I thought it was really smart of them to take Alexander Stubb. So you don't often have Finland at the forefront of all of this, but he is kind of their secret weapon at the moment.
And he had to sort of explain why he was there. He said, you might be watching this thinking, why am I even here? And he said, look, we've got an 800-mile-long border with Russia.
Well, and that's really interesting. So, I mean, firstly, Alexander Stubb is pretty much the Trump whisperer. Meloni is also very good at charming him. He plays golf with him. Yeah. He played golf for Finland. He's very good at it.
Meloni looks very relaxed as well.
She's very relaxed. I think she has good chemistry, as they say, with Donald Trump too. But Stubb is the only European leader who has actually managed to change Trump's mind. So they went and played golf for a day. At the end of it, Trump came out saying, I think I'm being played by Putin. I mean, that was pretty remarkable. And you could tell that they had sort of quite a concerted campaign about this. They've managed to dig out lots of great clips from Russian state TV, which every day is basically sort of saying how they're playing Trump. They say it out loud. This is what they tell the population. And to be able to put that to him, I think was sort of like... he is a TV man. He understands the power of the message. I think all of that was very powerful. Alexander Stubb, though, is sort of like not only a Trump whisperer, but for him to be there, I thought was really interesting because, Finland is an example of how they've managed to come up with sort of, they had to cede territory at the end of their last war with Russia. They've had stability since then, but only because actually they fall in the sphere of influence of Europe, and they had European membership. They've joined NATO now, so I think that was a reminder to Putin to have him on the stage that he has had a massive strategic loss at the end of this war. Even if he gets that territory, he has a longer land border with Finland, and up until now Finland has been neutral. That's how they've sort of got away without being invaded, and now they are a member of NATO, and that is a huge loss that came about because of this war. But also it gives you a sense of how you might start to come up with a deal, because Finland has had to negotiate those problems before.
There was something slightly unsettling about the atmosphere, though, while they were sat round the table and they'd obviously game planned their strategy and who was going to say what.
Very weird.
Alex, I wonder what you thought of how deferential they were to the US president, who was sort of holding court. It was Trump's theatre, really, and the sort of very grandiose, thank you so much, President Trump, for having us all here, for the progress that you've made. And then they had to try and sort of get their barbs in when they could. But we know from 6 months ago the absolute catastrophe if you don't get that right and if you don't say thank you enough times.
It was quite extraordinary. Look, they were all playing the game because exactly as you say, it could have been a total explosion. But I find it absolutely bizarre that, here they are, in some ways kind of rewarding bad behaviour. Because what happened on the last occasion with poor old Zelensky, the leader of a nation that has been horrifically and illegally attacked, his countrymen murdered, and he got absolutely rinsed in the Oval Office. And here they are all trying to sort of tread on eggshells and flatter Trump's ego, etc. Now, listen, I think they probably absolutely had to do that. I do just want to make one point. I think Alexander Stuber was the standout star, by the way. I think he's so sort of impressive as a statesman. I looked him up and I was pleased to see that he studied in Britain. And I think there you go.
Well, actually, I interviewed him years ago and he said he learned everything he knows about politics from watching lots of episodes of Yes Minister.
You've got it. You've got it. So look, there is almost a serious point here. I think this is Britain's soft power at the LSE. He was apparently a star student, speaks a gazillion languages. Anyway, I just thought he was very impressive and looked him up afterwards. So yeah, listen, it was craven. They were all paying homage. They were all fluffing Trump's feathers, etc. But look, that's what you've got to do because a settlement without Trump is no settlement at all. You've got to do what you've got to do.
And Alex, I completely agree. I do sort of think it was an amazing spectacle, and obviously they'd all gamed it in order to try and get the result they want from this. But at the same time, I sort of think when we look back on this moment in history, that will be one of the moments when the rules-based system died, because we rewarded people for breaking them.
I think that's such an excellent point, and it basically Putin is going to win. However, whatever happens here, Putin has won, and we've all just got to accept that, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's
and
not
we've all
happened.
signed up to not believing in sort of just international law. I mean, even the stuff yesterday was very transactional. There's leaks coming out talking about promising to buy American weapons, and this is all relations now are just transactional rather than based on any kind of
or Trump is the
rules or law.
Trump is the embodiment.